And I just wanted a little freedom. I didn't want to sound like everybody else.
That's what you get for loving me.
Most people think they know Waylon Jennings. They think they know the voice, the attitude, the outlaw image, but they have no idea what that authenticity actually did. Because this wasn't just a man who said what he meant and lived how he wanted. This was someone who refused completely to fake a single moment of his life. No masks, no compromises, no apologies. Not in his music, not in his family, not even in rooms full of strangers he'd somehow turn into lifelong friends in minutes. He was fiercely loyal to the people he loved, brutally honest with the ones he didn't, and totally unwilling to bend, even when it cost him everything. And it did, more than once. But here's the part nobody talks about. That same raw, unfiltered authenticity didn't just shape a career, it helped generate over $63 million in humanitarian aid and played a role in saving millions of lives across an entire continent. That's not hype, that's not storytelling, that actually happened. So the real question isn't who Waylon Jennings was, it's this. How does a country boy from a small Texas town, just by refusing to be fake, end up changing the course of history? It began with 5 words, spoken into the frozen silence of Iowa. 5 words he didn't think twice about until they became the last thing he could ever take back. For 43 years they echoed, louder than any song he'd ever play. In 1958, Waylon Jennings was a nobody. Just a 21-year-old kid in Littlefield, Texas, spinning records as a radio DJ, talking into a microphone that barely talked back. No money, no connections, no future he could see. Then one ordinary afternoon turned into the moment everything changed. The door opened and in walked Buddy Holly. Not just a star, a force of nature. He didn't make small talk, he didn't ask if Waylon was ready. He handed him a bass guitar and dropped a challenge that sounded more like a dare. You've got 2 weeks, learn it. That was it. No safety net, just belief. For reasons Waylon never fully understood, Buddy saw something in him, something raw, something real. He pulled him in close, put him on the road, produced his first recordings, bought him new clothes, and gave him a mindset that would outlive them both. Don't let anyone tell you what you can't be. Don't ever put limits on yourself. Years later, Waylon would shrug it off, saying he had about as much star quality as an old shoe. But Buddy didn't see an old shoe. He saw a future legend. And that belief would lead them straight into a moment that would change everything forever. The cold wasn't just brutal that winter, it was deadly. And on one frozen night in 1959, a single seat on a plane became the difference between life and everything that came after. In January 1959, Buddy Holly launched the Winter Dance Party, a grueling 24-city tour cutting straight through the frozen Midwest. He wanted Waylon Jennings on bass. What followed felt less like a tour and more like survival. Temperatures plunged to 35 below zero. The tour bus kept breaking down over and over until the performers were burning newspapers inside it just to stay alive. The drummer landed in the hospital with frostbitten feet. Half the group was sick, exhausted, and barely holding on. By February 2nd, after a show at the Surf Ballroom in Clear Lake, Holly had enough. He chartered a small plane to the next stop, just 3 extra seats. Waylon was supposed to be on it, but the big bopper, battling the flu and too sick for another freezing bus ride, asked for his seat. Waylon didn't hesitate. He gave it up. When Holly heard, he laughed, leaning back like it was just another road joke. "So, you're not going with us tonight, huh? Well, I hope your old bus freezes up again."
It was the kind of thing friends say when the road feels endless, when tomorrow feels guaranteed. A few hours later, that plane went down in a frozen Iowa cornfield just miles from the airport. Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, the Big Bopper, and the pilot were killed instantly. Later, Waylon Jennings would only use one word to describe the moment he heard: numb. He didn't just miss the funeral.
You're never ready for someone dying, and when you feel guilty about it.
He was shut out, shoved back onto the bus while the tour barreled forward as if nothing had happened. And in the cold, hollow quiet that followed, the guitar became unbearable. Not an instrument, a reminder. Years later, his son, Shooter, would say it plainly. From that night on, his father believed he was living on borrowed time, not just surviving, but carrying a weight, a mission, to make every second count. Because Iowa didn't just happen, it left a scar. Something inside Waylon Jennings changed that night. Quiet, invisible at first, but unstoppable. From that point, time wasn't something to spend, it was something to guard. And silence? No longer an option when life demanded action. But the real test, the moment that would ignite everything, had yet to come. Before that, Waylon had miles to walk, mistakes to own, and a life to rebuild from scratch. Eventually, he reached for the guitar again, and when Nashville finally came into view, he wasn't chasing fame, he was chasing truth. The raw, honest, instinct-driven music Buddy Holly had shown him, the kind that doesn't follow a script, but cuts straight to the soul. What Waylon found in Nashville was a machine built to crush originality. The 1960s country scene ran on a simple rule. The label owned you, the producer controlled you, and the only thing that mattered was whether you fit into the same polished, predictable sound as everyone else. They wouldn't let him play with his own band. They wouldn't let him pick his own songs.
I always said, why? And why was not a welcome word in Nashville when I came here. When I wanted to do something, they'd say, well, you can't do that. And I'd always say, why?
And when he was shoved into a studio with Danny Davis, a producer who rolled his eyes and cracked jokes every time Waylon tried something different, the frustration boiled over. The next session, Waylon arrived carrying a pistol borrowed from Merle Haggard and announced in no uncertain terms that anyone still staring at their chart after the third take was going to have a problem. Later, during a contract negotiation with RCA, the label tried to offer him almost nothing. Waylon got so fed up that he stood mid-meeting and walked straight to the bathroom, leaving the executives staring after him, powerless. While he was gone, his manager let the silence do the talking. By the time Waylon returned, the label had folded to every single demand he dared to make. For the first time in Nashville history, a country artist had complete control over his own records. His manager met him in the hallway, deadpan. That was a $25,000 piss. With the reins of his music finally in his hands, everything shifted. Billy Joe Shaver, a relentless songwriter who had been chasing him for months, finally cornered him in a hallway. Growling like a man who'd had enough, Shaver said, "If you don't listen to these songs, I'm gonna whip your ass right here in front of God and everybody." Waylon listened, and the result was Honky Tonk Heroes, a record historians called the first true outlaw country album. By 1975, he was CMA Male Vocalist of the Year, delivering a speech that became legend. In 1976, he and Willie Nelson unleashed Wanted, The Outlaws, the first country album to ever go platinum. And when he lent his voice as the narrator of The Dukes of Hazzard, it became the soundtrack of a generation. But Waylon's rebellion wasn't just about breaking Nashville's rules, it was about fighting for the people and music he believed in. And that made him more than a rebel. It made him a legend.
Columbia Records tried to mess with Willie Nelson's Red-Headed Stranger. They wanted to layer studio polish over the raw tracks, claiming it sounded like a demo.
Waylon was in that meeting. He lost it. He called the label president a tone-deaf son of... then threatened to fire their shared manager if a single note was touched. The album went out exactly as Willie recorded it. It went gold. Then came a friendship nobody in country music saw coming: Muhammad Ali. Chris Christopherson introduced them in 1978, and suddenly a Texas outlaw and the most famous boxer on earth were inseparable. Real friends, the kind who show up without being asked. When Waylon's son, Shooter, was born, Ali came to the christening, plopped on the couch and grinned. "I'm here to integrate this joint." He became Shooter's godfather, and that bond lasted until the end. Authenticity doesn't care about where you're from or what you look like. It only cares if you mean what you say, and these two men always did. One day, in a room full of people too scared to speak the truth, that authenticity would matter more than any hit record or platinum album ever could. And then there was Waylon himself. He bragged he never drank a drop of alcohol in his life. Technically true. What he didn't mention, spending $1,500 a day on cocaine while saying it. He was on drugs for 21 years, almost non-stop. He later told an interviewer, with the kind of brutal honesty only a man who survived his own chaos can muster, that he'd sit there completely stoned, but somehow feeling proud because at least he never touched a drink. At his peak, he was railing 7 grams a day, waking at 3 a.m. for another line, and hiding cocaine in briefcases all over his house like a paranoid mob boss, just to make sure he'd never run dry. Then came 1977. The DEA showed up at the Nashville studio where he was recording. What happened next could have been ripped straight from a Hollywood script, except no one would believe it. His drummer, Richie Albright, hit the talkback button on the mixing board, sending the agents' voices directly into Waylon's headphones. While Waylon stalled, pointing out that the arrest warrant had the wrong address, Albright went into action. He grabbed every last gram of cocaine, shoved it down his pants, strolled calmly into the bathroom, and flushed it all. The charges vanished. Waylon even wrote a song about it. But the drugs didn't stop, and neither did the fallout. He was bankrupt, drowning in $2.5 million of debt. He got booed off a Portland stage after barely scraping through a few songs. He missed a White House lunch with President Carter because he was too wired to show up. His wife, Jessie, adored his honesty, but hated what cocaine had done to him. She spent years force-feeding him protein shakes just to keep him alive because the drug had destroyed his appetite entirely. Then came the moment that broke him. Waylon walked in and saw his 3-year-old son, Shooter, on the floor with a cut-off straw pressed to his nose, pretending to snort cocaine, pretending to be just like his father. It was the single most devastating thing Waylon Jennings had ever witnessed, and even that wasn't enough to make him quit. He fought for 2 more years before finding the strength. Then, one quiet afternoon, something miraculous happened. Shooter came over, slipped his tiny arm through his father's, and for over an hour they just sat coloring, no words, no distractions, just a father and son reconnecting. That was the moment Waylon realized he could finally live again. For the first time, Waylon's son could sit next to him without chaos erupting, a small miracle for a man who had been too scattered for a child to even touch. When rehab was offered, he refused with a one-liner that could have come straight from Waylon Jennings. "Betty Ford didn't get me on it, and she can't get me off it."
Instead, he drove to a remote cabin in the Arizona desert and went cold turkey for 30 days, armed with nothing but Jesse, his iron will, and $20,000 worth of cocaine parked on his tour bus, an ultimate test he refused to fail. When it was over, he told Jessie to flush every last gram. She did. He cut off his famous red braids. Connie hand-delivered them to Waylon as a sobriety gift. Johnny Cash threw a party.
Years later, hospital corridors would bring them together again, both men recovering from life-saving bypass surgery, rooms across the hall from each other, their bodies refusing to let them part. And while no one watched, the high school dropout turned student. On his tour bus between shows, he studied, watched educational tapes, and earned his GED at 52, all to show his 10-year-old son that education mattered. No interviews, no headlines, just the same stubbornness that Nashville despised, the same stubbornness that saved his life. And less than a year later, that stubbornness was about to change everything in a way nobody, not even Waylon, could have predicted. Years later, Waylon's son, Shooter, would say something about his father that cut through every legend, every headline, every outlaw myth that Nashville had ever built around the man. Shooter's words pierced straight to the truth. "The biggest misrepresentation about my dad," he said, "is that he was this tough guy, this outlaw, or whatever people made him out to be. The truth is, he was just someone who cared, really cared about other people, about music, and that was it." But caring about people, as it turns out, doesn't always mean treating them well, and Waylon Jennings knew that better than anyone. He was a man of deep passion, but also deep stubbornness. He had been married 3 times before he met Jessie Coulter, and every one of those marriages ended the same way, because Waylon simply could not bend, not for anyone, not even for the people who loved him most. That $2.5 million in debt? That was only the beginning. It was the first of 3 times he would be completely, utterly broke. And at least one of those financial disasters was made worse by a man named Neil Russian, a manager Waylon had personally vouched for, recommending him to Willie Nelson as a lawyer and CPA, despite the fact that Russian was neither. In Waylon's world, loyalty often came first, even when it carried a heavy price. Russian's negligence alone had cost Willie more than $2 million in unpaid taxes, and Waylon was too lost in his own addiction to notice how his closest allies were quietly betraying him. The grudges he carried weren't fleeting, they were lifelong, absolute, and utterly unforgivable in his eyes. He never forgave Merle Haggard for a poker game early in his career, even decades later, even as they shared the same stages, the same friends, the same industry. The fissures in his life ran deeper. Tom Paul Glazer, the man who had helped Waylon build the outlaw movement from scratch, was gone from his world after a cocaine-fueled argument over money. They never spoke again, never reconciled, and both died carrying the silence between them. And then there were moments like George Jones showing up at Waylon's house, drunk and belligerent, swinging a punch at him in the dark. Waylon tied Jones to a tree, where he reportedly screamed, "I'm the greatest country singer of all time." Waylon, watching the scene unfold, said nothing for a moment before finally muttering, "Yeah, and you're tied to a tree." By the end of his drug years, Waylon admitted he was destroying the people around him without even knowing it. The harm he inflicted on the people who loved him most, the friends, the family, the fellow musicians, was something he could never fully repair. He was not a hero, not in the traditional sense, and he would have been the first to tell you that. "I'm just a man," he said once, "no more, no less. Bad is the worst, good is the best." But he knew that staring your own failures in the face, being honest about them, carried its own kind of courage. And in January of 1985, that courage was about to be tested, not in some private battle, not against a dealer or a rival, but in a room full of people who had far more at stake than Waylon Jennings ever did. A few weeks before the most legendary recording session in music history, the world had already been warned about what happens when fame, good intentions, and misunderstanding collide on a global stage. It came first from Britain. A charity single called "Do They Know It's Christmas" exploded across radios like a cultural earthquake. It brought together some of the biggest names in British music at the time: Bono, Sting, George Michael, and many more, united under one mission: raise money to fight famine in Ethiopia.
And it worked. Millions were raised. The impact was massive, the intention undeniably powerful. But then came the blind spot no one saw coming.
The song's central question, asking whether people in Ethiopia even knew it was Christmas, landed with a shocking lack of awareness. Ethiopia, in reality, is home to one of the oldest Christian traditions on earth, celebrating Christmas for more than 1,000 years. What was meant as compassion suddenly felt to many like condescension wrapped in melody. The backlash hit fast and hard. Critics called it insensitive, even patronizing. The controversy grew so loud that Bob Geldof, the man who had helped drive the entire project, would later admit it stood among the worst songs ever made, despite its noble purpose. And in America, the message was received clearly. If they were going to do something on that scale, it had to be different, more careful, more informed, more precise. That responsibility fell to Harry Belafonte, who began assembling something even bigger. He brought in Michael Jackson and Lionel Richie to write it, Quincy Jones to produce it, and 46 of the most recognizable voices in the country to bring it to life. Jackson and Richie spent days locked in, line by line, making sure nothing in the lyrics could be misread, misinterpreted, or misunderstood the way the British effort had been. Every word had to carry weight and clarity. Then came January 28, 1985. Fresh from the American Music Awards, the artists poured into A&M Studios in Hollywood. The energy in the room was unreal, electric, chaotic, historic. Quincy Jones hung a simple sign on the wall as everyone arrived: "Check your egos at the door." Not everyone made it. Prince, despite winning 3 awards that night, never showed. Bob Dylan arrived and nearly unraveled at the microphone until Stevie Wonder stepped in, easing the tension with a playful, uncanny imitation of Dylan himself that broke the pressure in the room. Willie Nelson drifted into conversation with Ray Charles about life back home, talking about farmers, struggle, and the idea that music could do more than entertain, it could help. Hours passed, voices grew tired, the studio lights felt heavier. By 3 a.m., exhaustion had settled over everyone like a fog, and that's when an unexpected problem surfaced, one nobody in the room had prepared for. Just as the most famous voices on the planet were locking in what was supposed to be a historic chorus, something completely unexpected brought the session to a standstill. At the end of the track, Michael Jackson had added a vocal ad-lib, an improvised wordless phrase that sounded African but didn't actually mean anything. It wasn't written in any language, it was just sound, meant to feel right in the moment. But Bob Geldof wasn't convinced. To him, it crossed a line. It felt like the very people they were trying to help were being reduced to a vague, unfamiliar noise. So Stevie Wonder stepped out of the studio, made a phone call to a friend in Nigeria, and came back with something different, an actual Swahili phrase to replace it. Real words, real meaning. And suddenly the room went still. 45 of the biggest names in music sat there in silence, none of them willing to be the one to question Stevie Wonder. Then Waylon Jennings broke it. The country outlaw who had spent his life trusting his instincts over the room looked around and shook his head. "Well," he said, "ain't no good old boy ever sung Swahili. I think I'm out of here." And just like that, he walked out. No argument, no debate, just a line drawn in the sand and one of country music's toughest voices refusing to cross it. He walked out of that studio and the entire session came apart at the seams. Ray Charles didn't sugarcoat it. "It's 3 in the goddamn morning," he said. "I can't even sing in English no more." Cyndi Lauper compared the whole thing to trying to sing to English speakers in German and hoping it lands. Even Bob Geldof, the man who had already survived the cultural backlash of the British version, made it clear this wasn't meant for the people it was about. It was meant for the people who could actually change something. Then someone stopped everything cold.
Stevie Wonder had quietly brought 2 Ethiopian women into the studio as guests, a gesture of gratitude for the artists involved. But there was one problem that no one had considered. They didn't speak Swahili, because in Ethiopia, the language isn't Swahili, it's Amharic. Just like that, the line was gone. The Swahili phrase was scrapped and replaced with something simpler, something universal. One world, our children, and the song moved forward. Eventually selling over 20 million copies, winning 4 Grammy Awards and raising more than $63 million for humanitarian aid across 7 African nations. But here's the twist nobody saw coming. If that Swahili line had stayed, if no one had questioned it, if the final version had carried that same blind spot critics had already torn apart in Do They Know It's Christmas, then this record would have become an even bigger controversy. Another well-meaning global anthem tripping over the very misunderstanding it was trying to fix. And yet, in the middle of all that chaos, something unexpected happened. The mistake was caught in time. Waylon didn't set out to save a song. He didn't set out to influence anything beyond that room. But sometimes being in the right place at the wrong moment changes everything. Muhammad Ali was his son's godfather. Charlie Pride, one of the most important black voices in country music history, was one of his closest friends. This wasn't a man disconnected from other cultures, it was the opposite. And in a studio already on the edge of collapse, that perspective quietly changed the ending. He had a lifelong intolerance for dishonesty, and when he felt it in that room at 3 in the morning, it hit him like a switch flipping off. He didn't argue, he didn't explain, he simply stood up and walked out, because that was the only language he ever trusted when something felt false. But that instinct to leave, to burn bridges, to outrun discomfort had come at a cost. Years of cocaine, a lifetime of cigarettes, and a body pushed far past its limits had already taken their toll. A triple bypass at 51 was the first warning. Diabetes followed like a slow erosion, taking him piece by piece until there was almost nothing left to give. By 2001, his left foot was gone. By his final months, so was his independence, confined to a wheelchair as the life he once outran finally caught up to him. That same year, when he was inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame, he didn't show. He was too sick to attend and said the honor didn't mean a thing, because even at the very end, he was still Waylon Jennings, unfiltered, unbending, unchanged. And yet, in those last quiet months, something softened. He took Jessie's hand and said something she would never forget, not because it was loud, but because it was different. After 32 years of marriage, the man who had always kept one foot out the door finally said, "You were my home." On his last Thanksgiving, just 2 months before he died, she asked him if he was ready to accept the Lord. He gave a small grin, like he'd been waiting for the question his whole life, and said, "I knew you were going to ask that." And this time, he didn't walk away. Right after Christmas, instead of silence, he asked her for something that mattered, the old hymn she'd grown up singing, not for comfort in the background, but as an anchor, something steady enough to keep the room from slipping apart while everything else quietly faded. He stayed there, still and focused, listening in a way that felt deliberate, like he was committing every note to memory one final time. When he finally spoke, it wasn't loud, but it carried weight that couldn't be ignored. "Don't let the boys stop playing my music." And then the moment came. February 13th, 2002. At 64, the outlaw who had once outrun death on a frozen Iowa night reached the end of his road for good. Years down the line, Hank Williams Jr. didn't just return, he stepped back onto the Grand Ole Opry stage after 20 years away with a purpose, to honor him. He didn't soften it or make it pretty, he said it straight, admitting he knew Waylon wouldn't have cared much for the tribute, and still the emotion broke through as he said it, eyes filled with something he couldn't hold back. Somewhere, still wrapped around Shooter Jennings's wrist, is a gold bracelet his father gave him before the end. Etched inside are 7 quiet words, not meant for the world, but carrying the weight of a promise passed from one life to the next. The music is in good hands. He's worn it through everything, even while accepting 2 Grammys, not as a symbol of success, but as a reminder that legacy was always the real mission. And when Shooter reflects on it, he traces it all back to that frozen night in Iowa. Everything his father became afterward rooted in one truth. He knew time wasn't promised, and he refused to waste it pretending to be someone he wasn't. Early on, Buddy Holly gave him a line that stuck deeper than most ever do. Don't ever let people tell you you can't do something. And he didn't. Not once, not for any audience, not for any gatekeeper, not for an industry determined to mold him into something easier to sell. Because in the end, a man from Littlefield, Texas, who refused to be anything but himself, didn't just succeed, he forced country music to expand its boundaries and redefine what it could be. And what he left behind doesn't need to be dressed up or explained, it stands on its own. Being real will never be the easy path. It won't come cheap, but if his life proved anything, it's this. The price of pretending will always cost you more than the risk of being exactly who you are.